And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God.
The revelation of Jesus Christ.
But here we are in the book of Revelation, and I'm going to try to bring us up to speed. We're looking at Revelation 10:10 and following. But what did we have before that in Revelation chapter 10? John was given a book to eat. There was a strong angel, and he had one foot on the land and the other foot on the sea. And he symbolizes taking possession of the sea and the land. And he told John not to write what the seven peals of thunder said. They said something intelligible. He started to write it, but he was told not to write it. So it's something that God's preserving unannounced, though he did tell it to John, and John will be able to bear witness that that's what God said, what the angel said, the peals of thunder said. And then the angel swears that there will be delay no longer. We saw that there was a parallel between what the angel was saying there and Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. The time of distress, the little book, sealed scroll, 3.5 years. Talking about this same 3.5 years that we're going to be looking at here in the rest of, most of the rest of the book of Revelation. In Revelation 10:7, we saw this, but in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, then the mystery of God is finished, as he preached to his servants, the prophets. So the idea there is that in the sounding of the seventh trumpet, it's all of the bowl judgments. And in this course of the seven bowl judgments, which are the seventh seal, the mystery of God will be finished. And we looked at that concept of mystery, and we thought about the fact that it's something that was previously hidden is now being revealed. And it's being revealed in these bold judgments. And we saw that it was something that was preached to his servants, the prophets. And that matches up a whole lot given to his prophets about the millennial kingdom, and a whole lot in the remainder of Revelation about the coming of the millennial kingdom. So we think this mystery is what's being unveiled concerning the millennial kingdom. It'll be unveiled in these seven bowls. His servants, the prophets, we looked at that and decided they were Old Testament prophets. And then in verse 8, we saw John recommissioned. He was to go and take the book. The angel from whom he took the book, or the scroll, said, now you need to eat it. And it had this bitter and sweet combination. In the mouth, sweet; in the stomach, bitter. In the mouth had to do with what he was learning from God, and that was sweet to learn what God was revealing. The stomach, bitter, had to do with what it was going to do to all of the nations and how it was going to impact the world, and that was going to be very bitter. And that brings us to Revelation 10:10, where we need to take up. I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it. In my mouth it was sweet as honey, and when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. I'm going to take this literally. He actually took this scroll and he ate it. Of course, the whole thing is in a vision. He is seeing a vision that's given to him by God. But the vision was that he took this scroll and he ate it. And first it was sweet, and then it was bitter. Verse 11. And they said to me, and so you have to try to figure out here who we're talking about when it says they said to me. Obviously more than one person said something to him. They said to me. Probably the voice of the heavenly angel and the voice. There were two sources of voices that were coming here, and that's what we've had in the previous context. Could also be just general, just undefined. They said to me, and you don't necessarily know exactly where it came from. It's translated here as a past tense. They said to me, but in the original text it is present tense, and that's very common. The Greek would oftentimes switch to a present tense where a past tense would be expected, where we'd always use a past tense. And the idea here is that these voices talking to him said, you must prophesy again concerning many peoples and so forth. So you expect that past tense, but here it's actually a present tense, and that doesn't change when things are happening. What it changes is that it's more dynamic and more vivid. I was there and I see this, that kind of a thing, and that's what he's describing here. They said to me, you must prophesy again concerning many peoples. You must. Word it is necessary. It is God's will. It's God's direction. This is what you're going to do. It's necessary for you to do this. You must prophesy again. Of course, it's again because he has been prophesying all the way through the book. Up to this point, he's been prophesying. And it's concerning many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. The word there could have been translated against many peoples and nations and tongues and kings, but his prophecies are going to be both favorable and critical, or describing catastrophes that are going to happen. So it's concerning is the meaning here. Concerning many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. And the many applies to all four categories: peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. As you read it in the English, you might think of it in terms of many peoples and also nations and tongues and kings. But in the original text, it is very clear that it is many nations, many peoples, many tongues, many kings, because the many controls all four of those categories in the way the grammar is put together again. And the kings tell us that God outranks even the very highest on the earth. God is going to tell kings what it is, just like everybody else. And then John is to measure the temple. Now we're switching to the temple as we begin chapter 11. John's first task is to measure the temple, but he's not going to tell us what the measurements are. So in verse 1, chapter 11, then there was given me a measuring rod like a staff. And someone said, get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. We're told that the measuring rod was like a staff. It's just a little bit longer than Dave's staff. Actually quite a bit longer than Dave's staff, but you're familiar with seeing Dave around here with, he calls it Slim, is that right? With Slim. And his Slim is only about 5 feet long, something like that. We're not told how long this one was. Ezekiel did a similar thing, and you can read about it in the book of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel's measuring rod was 9 feet long. That doesn't tell us that this one is 9 feet long, but it just tells us this rod could be a fairly long thing. And it's better than using a yardstick, because you could use it one time where you'd have to use the yardstick 3 times if it's that long, and it very possibly is. And so he's measuring out. What is he going to measure? He's going to measure the temple and the altar and the people who worship. Going to Measure the temple, the altar, and the people who worship. And you're having trouble with measuring the people, aren't you? I understand that. It's a case where the word measure can be used in two different ways. If you measure the people, you're counting them. How many people are there? You're going to measure that. And you're going to measure the temple, and you're going to measure the altar. Okay? But the word measure only occurs one time, and it applies to the temple, the altar, and the people. It's an example of a fairly unusual kind of Greek structure in which one verb applies to two different subjects in different ways, even though it's the same verb. Measure the temple, that has to do with using this rod, and how many rods is it from this place to that place, and measure the altar the same way. But when it comes to measuring the people, well, you measure them in a different way. You're counting. Do you know the shepherds measured their sheep using a rod? They used a rod for measuring their sheep because they would have the sheep pass underneath the rod, and when the nose went past or the tail went past or something, that sheep got counted. And so the rod was a tool to figure out the numbers more accurately. And the rod could be used that way with people too. And so he was measuring the temple, the altar, and the worshipers. And understanding that helps us to understand what the temple was. Because you see, there are people who say the temple is the church. And that really doesn't work when you look at it more carefully. But there are people who want it to mean the church. Now, there hasn't been any reference to the church in the book of Revelation since chapter 3. Chapters 2 and 3 were the messages to the 7 churches. The church has not been mentioned again. We haven't seen hide nor hair of the church in chapters 4 through 10. But some people look at this temple and say, well, that's the church. But what is the church? The church is the people. And so if you're going to measure the temple, and the temple is the church, you're measuring the people. And then when you measure the worshipers, what are you measuring? The people. Therefore, probably isn't saying he measured the people and the altar and the people. See what I'm saying? It doesn't make good sense. The other thing that doesn't make good sense is the altar. The altar goes with what? The temple. And so we're going to say this is the temple, which is interesting because this is the first time we have been told explicitly about a temple during the 7 years of tribulation. We're right in the middle of the 7 years of tribulation. We've gone through all the scroll openings. We've gone through all the trumpet judgments except number 7. And now, all of a sudden, we have the train went by without me. Okay. All right. We have the temple. Here's the temple he's talking about, just suddenly. He's measuring the temple. Well, for him to measure the temple, we say, okay, there has to be a temple. And so there is a temple right here in the middle of the 7 years of tribulation. All right. So we got a temple there. Where did it come from? When did it get built? Well, we're really not told about that, are we? Ezekiel told us about a temple. If you go back to Ezekiel chapter 40 and following, you can read a very detailed description of a temple which to this day has never existed. Nothing of that measurement and that exact configuration has ever existed. It's going to exist sometime in the future. Doesn't exist yet. The other thing we're going to follow is the fact that the prince, back in Daniel 9, we talked about Daniel 9 this morning. It's not here in my notes yet, but I'm going to read ahead and read about the prince. Daniel 9:27, he, that is the prince, that's the Antichrist, he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. 1 week here is 7 years. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. The one who makes desolate is this prince, this Antichrist. He's going to put a stop to the sacrifice, and Daniel tells us he's going to put a stop to the sacrifice in the middle of the week. Middle of the week of 7 years is 3.5 years in, with 3.5 years left. And so there's a temple, according to Daniel, halfway through the tribulation period, the 70th week. And we'll read the rest of that when we actually get to where I was supposed to use that. But there's a temple existing at that time. And our text tells us about a court that is not going to be measured. Then there was given me a measuring rod like a staff. And someone said, get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who dwell in it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. How long is 42 months? 3.5 years. The Gentiles, the nations, are going to tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Daniel told us it was going to be in the middle of the week. Week is 7 years. Its middle of the week is 3.5 years, which is 42 months. Same 42 months. It's the second half of the tribulation period. Okay. There's a temple that exists, and this court that he's not going to measure is given to the nations. Okay, don't measure the court, because it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Now, what is this court? It is outside the temple. And the word temple there could be just the Holy of Holies. It could be the Holy of Holies and the holy place and none of the courts. Or it could be the temple, holy place, and the men's court and the women's court. And there was a third court, and that court was known as the court of the Gentiles. So it could be any of these things, according to the grammar in our text. According to our understanding, this is something that had been given to the nations. Is that what it said there? Leave out the court, which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. So this court that he's not going to measure, he's not going to measure it, because it's one that had been given to the nations. It was given to the nations. Why did God give a court to the nations? There was a place for those who were not Jews to come and approach to God. They couldn't come into the women's court. They couldn't come into the men's court. They couldn't go into any of the rest of it. But they had a court which was for them. You remember when Jesus was on the earth, he got quite unhappy about what they were doing in the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. What were they doing there? Yeah. Buying and selling. They were buying and selling, money changers, and they had the birds, and they had the The animals and all that was going on in the court of the Gentiles. This court was set aside for people from all the nations to come to God's house, a house of prayer, as Jesus said. But here he's talking about a court that had been given to the nations, and John's not to measure that. He's going to measure the part that is of particular interest to God, the part that's particularly precious to God. That's the Holy of Holies, the holy place, and the men's court and the women's court. That's what I think. You can make that division at the actual temple and leave all the courts that way, or take it the other way. But since it was the court of the Gentiles, and we're talking about the Gentiles here, I really think that's where the division is. And so God has a special interest in this part that belongs to Israel. But he's not going to take the same kind of an interest in the outer court. It's a measure of God's favor. What happened just before this? Just before this, we had the sixth trumpet, and a third of the population of the earth died under that trumpet. The people who died did not repent. The people who were still living did not repent. And so we're right in the middle, and we're having this big shift, and it's going to go from kind of they're hard preliminaries, but they're just preliminaries up to this point. And we're going to go to the real business of cleaning the place up so that God can set up his kingdom. And where there had been a court of the Gentiles up until this time, there's still such a court, but God's not particularly interested anymore because he's not showing any mercy to the Gentiles. Why is he not showing any more mercy to them? They had their opportunity. God gave them the most strenuous, the most severe encouragement to repent, and they didn't. And now he's shifted gears, and he's no more court for them, no court for the Gentiles. We're going to go on from there. So that's the idea. John's to measure the part that is possession of God. We're not told what the measurement is. Ezekiel gives us a lot of measurements. John, in the book of Revelation, gives us no measurements. We know that he measured it. So the measuring is not so that we'll know dimensions. It's so that we will know what part is favored by God. People measure what they own. Huh? You do that? Yeah. My folks have had a piece of property, They don't have it anymore. They're gone. But they had a piece of property, 5 acres, and they told me exactly where one corner was. I haven't known where that corner or that corner or that corner was, but this corner, I knew where that was. I could remember it, telephone pole near it, and a stake in the ground and a little surveyor's tag on it. I knew where one corner of our 5 acres was. Last June, we were out there and we found all 4 corners. That one, those 2 over there. Pipes in every one of them, little tags on all the pipes. We know exactly where all the corners are now. And my son John gets home and he looks at Google Earth. And the property boundaries on our property says, Dad, that cannot possibly be the corner of our property. And so I looked at Google Earth, and you know what? He's right, and we've been wrong for 50 years. And that property that I knew I owned for 50 years just didn't become mine anymore. It's all gone. But why do I tell you this story? My wife can't figure out any reason for it whatsoever. But I tell you the story to say we measure what we own. Property right next to us belongs to the Bureau of Land Management. I mean, for Many hundred yards it belongs to the Bureau of Land Management. Nobody's going to build on that property. That's nice. And this is a little triangle, 2.5 acres, that used to belong to us, that doesn't belong to us. Well, it never belonged to us. But we're out there, and the only reason why measure it? All of this Bureau of Land Management stuff out here is just as useful to us as the stuff we own, except we get billed on it. But we've got it measured off because somehow it's more precious if it belongs to us. And that's what God is doing with the temple. It's His. He's measuring it off. But He's leaving out the court of the Gentiles. How come He's leaving that off? Not so precious. Not so important. The Gentiles have proven themselves they're never going to repent. What's the purpose of giving them a spot to approach to God? So the measurement is about what? It's about God's favor. God's favor. God's favor is on the temple. Now, as you go through this, the temple is going to be desecrated. And I'm going to read about that to you. The Antichrist is going to desecrate the temple. And the nations are going to trample through this place. And not just the part that was not measured, but the part that was measured. So this is really about God's favor, not about who gets to be there and do stuff with this property. It's just about God's favor. Okay, so I can get back to my notes here. He's going to measure the temple. There's a temple there. And he's going to measure the altar. What altar is he measuring? Every altar that we have seen so far in the book of Revelation has been which altar? There are two to choose from. They have all been incense. Altar of incense, the golden altar. The altar on which the sacrifices were burned was the brazen altar. And everyone so far has been about the golden altar. Guess what? I'm sorry, everyone's been about the golden altar up until now. Guess what? We've just come to the brazen altar. Every one of those was in heaven. This one is on earth. We are back on earth where these things are being described by John at this point. And it appears that the people have access to this altar. There was given to me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, get up and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship in it. Leave out the court, which is outside the temple. Do not measure it. For it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Some people worship in it. The people who worship in it are being measured. Well, they worship in the temple, at the altar. What part of the temple can the people go into? Can they go into the holy place? They cannot. Can they go into the Holy of Holies? They cannot. If they are women, they can't even go into the men's court. And if they are not Jews, they can't go into the women's court. But outside, in the outer court, there is an altar, a brazen altar, an altar of sacrifice. And everybody's invited to the altar of sacrifice. What is it? Does that tell us anything of spiritual significance? God offers a sacrifice for sin to anybody who will come. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. These people come to worship, and when they come to worship, they come to the altar. That's where you have to start. That's where the sacrifice starts. The altar they come to is which altar? The golden altar or the brazen altar? Brazen altar. And that's what this is. We are at the brazen altar that he is measuring as special for his own interests. One more thing, I'm really out of time. Animal sacrifices. Animal sacrifices. The Jews are without a place to make animal sacrifices. Why is that important? Well, it really isn't, because they should be coming to Jesus Christ and He's paid for everything. But in their mind, Christ is not the Messiah. We're pretty sure He is. We talked about that this morning, didn't we? We're pretty sure He is, but they don't understand that, and they don't have any way to make an atonement for sin. Would that be precious to them to get a temple and an altar and a place to make a sacrifice? Hugely important. They're very eager to get an altar, at least the Orthodox, the really fundamental part of the group. They want to get their altar back. And just as soon as they get the privilege of having a temple and an altar, what keeps them from having it? The Muslims. Islam keeps them from having it. So all those Arabs, supposing they went in there and said, okay, we're gonna rebuild our temple in its original location. Thank you very much. We're here to do it. What would that look like? Hey, the war. They have had war over some far, far less serious things just in the last few weeks. And they're having people being killed over there over the suspicion that maybe Israel's going to do some little thing up there on that platform. And so the thing that keeps them is all the Arabs. How do you suppose they get to have a temple there by the middle of the tribulation period?
The Arabs are around to take care of it.
Hmm?
The Arabs are not going to be in that particular area.
Okay. What's the mark according to Daniel of the beginning of this period?
Peace treaty.
Peace treaty. Did I read that? I haven't read that yet, have I? Because I haven't come to that in my notes, and I got to save that for next time, because I'm getting really past the place now. I think what happened was when the prince, the Antichrist, makes the treaty, the motivation for the treaty for the Jews is we get our temple. Antichrist is ruling the whole world. He can control the Arabs. He can control the situation. He can control the whole thing. In the middle of the week, 3.5 years in, what does the Antichrist do? He stops the sacrifices. Well, the fact that he stops the sacrifices at that point means that sacrifices have been going on up until that point. There are no sacrifices being done there now. Something happened so that they were able to make sacrifices up to the middle point. I think that was the treaty. There was a treaty made, and that treaty provided the Jews could build their temple. They could have their altar. And here in the middle, this altar, this brazen altar, is going to become a real issue as the Antichrist says, okay, we're not going to do the animal sacrifices here anymore. Okay. We need to talk more about animal sacrifices next time, but that's next time. Questions?
So they would have less than 3.5 years to build that temple and get it going and start that.
Oh, yes. There are people, I don't know if it's true or not true, but there are people who say the Jews have all the materials ready to go. You know, people can write anything they want to. I don't know if that's true or not true. But given the fact that there's going to be that sacrifice established, not going to take the same 40 years that it took Herod to build it. It's going to be built pretty fast. And I suspect that it's going to be built fast because they're ready to go. And I think when that treaty is made, they're ready to jump right in there. I don't think it'll take them any time at all to build that temple. Reestablish the sacrifices. Good point, though. Not very long to get a temple built.